exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series in VMware. More specifically, we're continuing on in the VMware Certified Professional version 6. Joining me back in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to dive right back into vSphere security. In the last couple episodes, we've taken a look at things like single sign-on and permissions management, user accounts, all that good stuff. In this episode, we're going to switch gears and talk about hardening our systems. Now, what do I mean by hardening? Well, when you do an initial install of software, like let's say it's vCenter or really any program in the world, you just hit next a bunch of times and it installs. It's going to install in a default manner. And the default manner is designed to be the most suitable for every user out there. It's kind of like trying to meet the needs of the lowest common denominator so that everybody is at least moderately happy with the end result. On a positive side, that means your system is going to work right out of the box. That's good. But on a negative side, it means there's a lot of things that are going to be turned on that you don't necessarily use. And if you don't use it, that's all stuff that is what's called increasing your attack surface. When a hacker tries to break into your system, they're going to look at all the things that you're running, and they're going to try and find the weakest element and get into it. So if there's things that you're not using, you should turn them off. Turn them off or restrict access. And that way, when that hacker looks to see all the stuff that can be attacked, they only see stuff that you're actually using. And you can focus on making those as secure as possible. So in this episode, and I say episode, it's probably going to be more than one episode because I got a lot to cover here. We're going to talk about hardening the ESXi hosts. We're going to talk about hardening vCenter. And we're going to talk about hardening our virtual machines to protect them from various types of attacks and denial of service and all the various other things that the baddies do out there on the network. So that's kind of our goal, and we got a lot to get through. So let's kick things off with the ESXi hosts. I want to take an ESXi host and harden it. Now, way back, episode 1 or 2, I don't know, we saw installing ESXi, and it was super easy. We booted off a CD, we hit next a bunch of times, we picked a hard drive, and it booted up, right? We were running ESXi. Then we imported it into our vCenter environment so that we could manage it. Now it's up and it's running. Well, there's a lot of services and a lot of network access on those ESXi boxes that we may not need or we may want to restrict. And the default configuration is actually a little on the loose side. So let's walk through that and take a look at what we've got. So I'm in my vCenter environment here. I'm going to do this all through vCenter if I can. And I'm going to go into my hosts and clusters. And I'm going to find my host. So I'm going to find this plab ESX01. And when I go into Manage, under Manage, we'll start to see our various settings and information. And what I'm looking for is the security profile, right? When you look at it, you've got things like your licensing, your system, and so on. And in here, we'll find our security profile buried away right here. There we go, security profile. Finding it is apparently the hardest part. And under the security profile, you're going to see two things, and each of these need your attention. The first one is the firewall. There is a network firewall on every single ESXi box. It's a software firewall, and it runs right from that machine. Now, why do I emphasize that? Well, with software firewalls, they're very effective. We can stop traffic on that host. The negative of a software firewall is that whatever the attack is, has already made it all the way to the host, and it's up to the host to stop it. So it's always better to stop that traffic with a real firewall, a physical firewall on your network, a firewall in between your LAN and your WAN, in between the internet and you. But those kind of firewalls don't stop internal attacks. I could have a disgruntled employee on my network. They're behind the firewall. And now they're trying to access this ESXi box. So the software firewall, while not as good as a real one, is still incredibly important because it's going to be protecting us from those internal attacks. And sadly, I saw some statistics, and it's like over 50% of attacks originate from inside of an organization. They're insider attacks, and that's not good. So when we look at this, I want you to notice the default firewall configuration. We've got things like the SIM server, NFC, virtual SAN, DHCP, DNS. As I look down this list, it's got the protocols defined, it's got their ports defined, and look at who can get at them. All. It's wide open. It is completely wide open. Anybody can access any one of these ports. Now, should I be terrified and worried? No. I mean, maybe a little worried, this much. But I don't need to be terrified because all of these are tied to services. For example, SSH. Okay, who can open up an SSH connection to my server? According to this, all IPs. Anybody can open up an SSH connection to this server. It's set to all. But if I scroll down to the next section are the services themselves, right? So here I can see my services, and I can see which services are running and which services are stopped. And what you may find is that SSH as a service, if I can get my little scroll to not go crazy on me. There we go. The SSH service may not be running. If SSH is not running, do I care if the port's open on the firewall? No. Sure, an attacker can get through port 22, great. And they connect to the server, and what do they get? Nothing. It just sits there and the connection times out because there was no server to answer them. But in my case, SSH is running. It's running, it's turned on. So an attacker can get through the firewall and connect to the SSH server. Now, do I need to be terrified about that? Not necessarily, because what do I need to connect with SSH? I need to authenticate. I need a username and a password. So I still have extra steps on top of this that are going to protect me. But the real lesson here is there may be services on here we don't care about. There may be services that we don't use. So for example, the Direct Console UI. Okay, this is the Direct Console user interface. Somebody could walk to that physical machine and access that user interface right there on the console. I may not use that. If I'm not using it, I should turn it off. Turn it off. I'm not using it. If I'm not using SNMP, turn it off. If I'm not using syslog, which I'm sure I am, but if I wasn't, you can turn it off. Any of these services, you can turn them off. All you got to do is hit the edit button up here. And when you're editing the services, you can go through and you can pick them. So I could pick SSH, for example, and I could stop it, and I could tell it not to start back up again. I can set it to start and stop manually, right? That way it'll only start when I want it to, and I'm going to leave it stopped. Now I don't have to worry about SSH anymore, okay? So if you're not using a service, stop it. Don't let it run, turn it off. But what if I need it? I need SSH. There are times where I might need to SSH into this host, so I don't want to stop SSH. But at the same time, I don't want just anybody being able to connect to it. So that's where the firewall comes in. That's why these two are packaged together. Stopping the service is 100% effective. If I stop SSH, nobody can connect to it, it's safe. But if I want even one person to connect to it, I've got to start the service. And so now that's no longer safe anymore, right? So now I go to the firewall instead. And when I go to the firewall, I got a few choices here of what I want to do. I'm going to find SSH in the list again. The list which, I didn't point this out, and I really should have. When you're looking at the firewall is actually divided into two pieces. It's hard to tell, but there's a section called incoming connections and a section called outgoing connections. So this is data from inside the server going out and data from outside the server coming in. Why would we want to filter outgoing connections? Outgoing means the ESXi box tries to reach out to something on its own. Okay, why would I need to filter that? Well, there's something called a leapfrog attack. A leapfrog attack is where maybe somebody on the internet is not allowed to access my Active Directory domain controller, right? So somebody on the internet cannot get to my domain controller. But my ESXi box, it might be allowed to get to the domain controller. It's in my DMZ or whatever, and I've allowed it to get to the domain controller. So an attacker could break into the ESXi box and then leapfrog through it to get to the domain controller. So I might want to filter outgoing connections to prevent that. Now, I'll tell you, it's not terribly effective, because if a hacker is already in the ESXi box, then they can go and adjust the firewall and turn off these rules. So you've got the outgoing connections rule, but they're not terribly effective. So we don't normally mess with those. We don't necessarily have to tweak them. You can, but incoming connections is the one we care about. And I couldn't find SSH when I was looking real quick, and it was because I was in the outgoing connections by accident. So I need to look at incoming, and inside of incoming, I should be able to find SSH. There it is right there. And it's set so that all users can use it. Now I'm going to edit that. So I need to go and find my edit button, which is up at the top. And I'm going to edit that, and I'm going to refine SSH. Now when you look at it here, it looks a little different than what we saw a moment ago. So I'm not just seeing straight up firewall ports, I'm seeing SSH, because I had highlighted it, and here it is. And it's showing the two different modes of SSH. This machine can be an SSH client, making outgoing connections, and it can be an SSH server receiving incoming connections. And so I've got incoming port 22 is enabled. It's got a little check mark by it. Outgoing 22 is disabled. I can't be an SSH client, which is perfectly fine with me. That's not how I'm going to use it anyway. So I can see that it is enabled, and right now it's just up and running. It's TCP port 22 the way we expect it, and right down here I see allow connections from any IP address. It's wide open. Anybody can connect to this thing. So I might want to restrict that, and you can restrict it a few different ways. So when you uncheck that, you can then put in who's allowed to get to it. You might want to be really specific. Hey, my laptop is at 192.168.0.222, so I'm going to allow that IP specifically, right? And maybe Wes's laptop is 192.168.0.174. That's great. I can put those in there, and now Wes and I will both be able to SSH into this box, assuming we have a username and password. Still have to have a username and password, right? But now I've restricted IPs that are allowed to connect. The challenge here, though, is what if we use DHCP? Well, I might be 222 today, but tomorrow I might be 135. So I would need to put DHCP reservations in for these laptops and so on. It becomes a bit of a hassle, right? So instead, what I might choose is to say, I'm going to put all my network administrators on one subnet. Maybe all of my network administrators are on the 192.168.5 network. And so I can add that. I can say 192.168.5.0/24. That's a subnet, CIDR subnet shorthand. And so I'm doing this CIDR notation, 192.168.5.0/24. That means 192.168.5.1 all the way through 192.168.5.254. So I'm getting that whole group right there in one. And I can mix and match. I'm mixing single IPs with entire ranges of IPs. And so you can plug that in to your heart's content. And if you forget, it's always got that little example right here where they show the different ways that you can kind of format it. And they show like a /22. /24s are really common, /16s, /8s. Those are the ones that we normally see. All right, so I'm going to punch those in. So now, is SSH enabled? Yes. SSH is still turned on, right? But I don't have to worry about internal employees trying to get to it that shouldn't be able to get to it because I've now restricted it. And if I come in here and find SSH in my list, whoops, my mouse is being compounded here, so let me find SSH in my list again. And now what we'll see is that it updates. Now my screen hasn't actually refreshed. So see how SSH for me is still showing TCP port 22 and all. So it hasn't updated. Well, down just a little bit, see how we've got these refresh buttons? That's refresh for the services. I don't remember if we have one for the firewall or not. We don't. So if it doesn't refresh, you can always use vCenter's big fat refresh button up there. That's what I'm going to hit and refresh that. And we should see that it no longer says all. Always a good idea to check this, because sometimes you might make a change, and I'm guilty of this. I think I've done it in the show already, where sometimes I'll hit cancel instead of OK, and I think the setting is in there, and then it turns out that it's not. But I can see it just whizzed by my screen right there. The SSH server now shows these are the 3 IPs or IP ranges that are allowed to get to it. So I'm restricting access to that connection. It's important that we do this. It's very simple to go in and punch it in. The guys at VMware can't do this for you because they don't know your network. They don't know what IPs you use. They don't know what's internal. They don't know where your network admins are. It's up to you to set that. So we just need to punch it in. It's not hard. You get it set up, and there it is. The hardest part about this is, what if I have 100 ESXi hosts? Do you want to go and connect to every single ESXi host and configure this by hand? It's kind of a nightmare, right? It's a lot of stuff to put in there. It'd be a hassle. Starting and stopping the services, opening and closing the firewall ports, getting all that set, it's kind of a pain. But the nice part about this is we can take these settings and turn it into what's called a security profile, right? I mean, it says security profile right here, right? This is the security profile for this one machine. But we can turn it into a host profile. A host profile is a collection of all of these settings. It gathers all those settings together into a host profile, and we can take that host profile and apply it to as many machines as we want. I can create one host profile, get it set up exactly the way that I want it, and then go and apply it wherever I need. Okay, host profiles, you actually see right down here just 2 more menu options. If I go to host profile, you'll see right now my host profile is none. I don't have one. I can attach one if I did have one, but I don't, right? So what I'm going to need is I'm going to need to create a host profile. The way it works right now, I need to create one. I don't have it, so I'll make one. All right. So what I'm going to do is I can go about it a few different ways. There is a centralized place we can go to mess with the host profiles. If I go to attach, though, when I go to attach, it's going to see that I don't have any. And I thought it gave me a create button here, but it actually doesn't. All right, so I guess we will do it the other way. So we need to go and create a host profile based on this particular host. So I've got plab ESX01. I'm going to use as my template. Step one, I need to get it set exactly the way that I want it, right? I need to customize the firewall rules. I need to update this, update that. I need to get all those things set. So right now I've actually got it set kind of a way that I don't want it to be. So I'm going to edit that SSH rule again, and I'm going to update my IP range. So I need to make sure that I've got the 192.168.0 network is what I want, and we'll just get rid of the rest of these IPs. All right, so basically you go in and you get everything configured the way you want. We can always edit these after the fact, so it's not set in stone. It's kind of an initial starting point. So get everything set the way you want, your security profile and your other settings, because they'll all be part of the host profile if you choose, and then we can deploy it together. All right, so I've now got that firewall set. I'm going to just refresh real quick and make sure that takes effect. I don't want to get burned on it not actually taking effect. And it did. Okay, I can see that setting is in there the way that I want it. Okay, now I can go and I can create a host profile. So I'm going to jump back to my home page. And inside of the home page, we're going to need to jump in and create this host profile. And what you'll find is these get buried away in a few different places. But if you look right here, you've got policies and profiles. And under policies and profiles, you'll find host profiles right here. And in my host profiles, I don't have any. So I need to create one. And you'll see you've got two different buttons up here. One of them is going to let me import a host profile. So if I had written one somewhere else, I could import it. The host profile is really an XML file. So you can take this XML file, lay out all your settings, and then import it quick and easy right here. So if you've already got it made in another vCenter environment, you can bring it right in. But I don't. So I'm going to hit this green plus sign to extract a profile from host, right? So that's what it's saying, extract host profile. And so now you can pick the host that you have configured the way you want. So I've got plab ESX01. That one is set exactly the way I want it. I've got a warning flag because it's in an evaluation license right now and it expires in 60 days. So that's what that warning is. So I'm going to choose that host. And once we pick it, and you can filter and search, you can pick your different vCenter servers if you have more than one, you do whatever it is you need to find that host. And once you find it, you can just hit the good old next button, and now you can give it a name. And so I might call this my production ESXi host profile, or this might be my DMZ ESXi host profile. I might have different needs. I might have a research and development one. I might have more than one host profile to meet the needs of that particular deployment. But I'll just call this one my production host profile. And we'll hit next. And then it's ready to complete. We can hit finish, and it's going to go and extract it. What it's going to do, and this takes a minute. And I think I've got my recent tasks minimized right now, so let me blow that up. There it goes. So it's creating a host profile, and this will take a minute because what it's going to do is it's going to go to that host, and it's going to collect every single setting from ESXi. So it's pulling the whole config. Then it's going to go through and delete any settings that are unique to that machine. For example, host name. Do I want all my ESXi hosts to have the same host name? No. So it's got to delete that. License. Am I using the same license on every ESXi host? No. So it's deleting the license. It's deleting any setting that should be unique. And what's left are the generic settings, the ones that we can apply to every machine that's out there. And so when it's done, I now have a production ESXi host profile sitting right there. Notice compliant hosts 0. I extracted it from the host, but I haven't actually applied it to anybody yet. And so when you apply it, somebody will show as compliant. If somebody goes in and starts dinking with the settings and changing things, they'll show as not compliant. In other words, they may not be configured the way that we want them to be configured. And so now it's up to us to go in and reapply that and get it secured. Okay, so right now, that's kind of the status that we're in. So I've got it. And from this screen, you'll see where I've got all these new buttons up here. I only had 2 buttons a minute ago, create and import. Now I've got duplicate. I've got where we can copy it We can delete it or check our host to make sure that everybody's compliant. We can attach or detach from a client, so I can actually attach it to a host from right here. And we can remediate. Remediate says if a host is no longer compliant, make them compliant. Go back and put the settings back to the way they were. So maybe somebody went in and they adjusted my SSH settings. I could just hit remediate, and it would take that host and put it right back to the way it was. Quick and easy way to ensure that all your machines have a consistent security policy. All right, so then you've got your other generic actions. Now, I point these buttons out here, although I don't actually use them very much. So instead, I usually attach it on the host, and you saw where we could do that, right? So if I go back to my home, and I go down to my, if I try and go back to home, and I go to my host and clusters, and I go in and I find that host inside of the settings, you've got host profile. And so right here we can attach it. And I find I do it from here. If you're going to attach the host profile to a bunch of machines at once, it's easier to do it from the profile screen I was on a moment ago. But if I'm just doing it to one, I'll usually do it from right here. And I can attach, and I'm going to attach its own profile back to it. Well, it doesn't actually know that the profile belongs to this machine because all the unique stuff has been deleted. This is just a generic old profile now. And I can apply it to this machine, and it'll ensure that we meet the requirements. And down here we can see network configuration and authentication configuration that's coming along with it. And so you'll be able to see, like, this one has the domain host joined, and under network I can see where I've got some virtual switch configurations and other things. This is all coming along with that profile. All right, so I'll hit next, and now it's going to start getting that attached and applied. Okay, once that's applied, now I know it'll be set the way I want it, and it's kind of already set the way I want it anyway. Now here I get my customizations, and on the customization side, what is this? Well, these are some of those unique settings, right? Settings that may not necessarily apply to other hosts, like name for this host. And so I can come in and I can give it a name and so on. So now we can specify anything that was truly unique that is now missing. All right, you've got the password for the account, the network host groups, and so on. Whether you want to enable or disable the hardware profiles, all these things kind of come along with it. And so you can specify the customizations. If you leave them blank, it's just going to leave whatever's on that system already. It might actually complain about some. Let's see. Yeah, so it is going to make me put in some of these things. I need a host IP address. I'll set that to the same one that it had already. And then continue on. I could have deleted these out of the profile too. I guess that would have made a little more sense, so I didn't have to do it. But I'll just punch these in so we can see it happen. I'll probably end up breaking my host. So let's see the name. This is plab ESX01. The iSCSI alias. I have no idea what my alias was before, so I'll just call it iSCSI01. Name shouldn't really impact things too much. The username. Now this is an interesting one because what's our default username in ESX? Root. Right? But here I can change it. I could actually pick something different if I wanted to. Now this is talking about joining the domain, and I don't use the root account for joining the domain, so I'm going to use whatever account it is that I'm using for that, and before I was using an account I made for myself, so I'll punch that one in. Oop, I will try. It's not, got that one locked, doesn't it? It's not letting me change it. There we go. It's appearing off screen, which is convenient, so let me get that moved around. And I'll punch in my password so it can join the domain. All right, so this is just kind of replacing that unique data for this machine. And in reality, I'm putting most of the same stuff that was already in there. MAC address is a little bit tricky. I don't think that one's a required field because it'll just use the MAC address it already has. So let me try that. There we go. Now it's validating. All right, so it's going to apply this profile. And I really shouldn't see anything different here because I'm applying this machine's own profile back to it. But if I had 100 other machines, I could then apply this profile to the 100 other machines, and they would all get set up the same way. And if I ever needed to change it, I could just go modify the profile. I could create a new profile and just reapply it to all those machines, and it's going to start happening. Now, it'll take a little while for that to apply, and I'm not going to wait for it, but if I go back to my home page and policies and profiles, I can take a look at that host profile. Whoops, I can click on the wrong spot, but I can take a look at that host profile, and I should see that it's now attached to a machine, and it's got an unknown state, and that's because it's applying right now. And when it's done, it's either going to go compliant or not compliant. It should go straight to compliant. If it goes straight to not compliant, that means that some setting had an error and failed to apply, and it's probably going to stay that way. So I'll need to go dig in my logs and find out what happened. But otherwise, it should end up in there and end up in compliant. If over time it becomes not compliant, that's where we just use the remediate button up here, and it'll make it compliant. It'll put those settings back to the way they were. So all kind of tied right into here. Host profiles are a great way to configure large quantities of machines and get them all set up consistently. All right, other things that we can do. When I take that profile, I probably should have done this before, is you can go to Actions and Edit Settings, and now you can edit the settings inside of that profile. And so you'll see where you can kind of tweak it. And what I should have done is taken some of the settings that were a part of it and removed them out of there just to make it easier to deploy. So for example, if all I really care about are the security services, I could have removed the networking configuration and the general settings and stuff like that. I could have removed all of these, and that way all I was pushing was security. And so I'm just kind of coming in and unchecking some of these, and that way we don't have to deal with it. Like that screen, right, to provide unique information, you don't want to do that 900 times, right? So if you pull that stuff and just leave security, right, that'll make life a lot easier. So I can take my advanced settings, I'll turn all these off, and like I said, I probably should have done this before, but I'm doing it after the fact. It was just one machine, so it didn't matter. If it was 900 machines, this would matter big time. Well, unless you're an hourly employee, I guess, then it would be fine. And the only other thing I have are general settings. So now my policy is much smaller. My policy now just has security settings, and that's it. And even inside of security settings, if I'm really just concerned about, oops, I missed one. If I'm really just concerned about services, then I may want to go in and limit that down a bit. So I've got firewall, security services, or security settings, and service configuration. So each of these we can break down and start to tweak a little more. I might not care so much about these security settings, and I'm really just worried about firewall and service configuration. So it's up to you what you want to push. Now I've made this host profile basically a security profile. And then on the next page we get customized hosts. And the customized host section is where we can try and answer some of those unique questions ahead of time. See, here's those values that I provided earlier, and they've been stored so that it can customize them. Those aren't going to apply anymore because I've disabled those settings. And we can finish that up. And anytime in the future I need to change it, I can do that. And once I change it, I just need to come in here and hit remediate, and it'll push all those changes out to all the hosts that have this profile attached. Great way to secure your systems and harden them. Turn off everything you don't use, push out consistent firewall settings, and make sure that nobody messes with those settings after the fact. All kind of right in one place. Some of the other things to talk about. We talked about the lockdown mode in an earlier episode. ESXi, by default, has a direct console UI, a DCUI. Somebody could walk up to the physical ESX box and access that console and try and break in, right? We may not want that. So you can disable the direct console and make it where you have to manage it from vCenter. vCenter is the only way to manage that host. So if we want to do that, we can turn it on. I could have made it a part of this profile. It's actually a setting that's available inside of the security profile, or we can do it by hand. If you bake it into the profile or do it by hand, the end result is the same. If you put it in the profile, it'll apply to all your machines. So we'll do it individually, since that'll be a little bit different. It'll be a chance to see something cooler. So I'm going to go back into my host, and in my host, I'm going to go to Manage and Settings, and then Security Profile. And the security profile is exactly where I was for looking at the firewall and the service settings. I just had never scrolled all the way down to the bottom. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, that's where you'll see lockdown mode. And that's where we can turn that on and stop people from getting to the direct console of that system. There's two modes, normal and strict. Strict is what you normally want, which makes you think that it should be called normal. But in strict mode, it is super strict. It's going to stop the direct console user interface service from running. It's not going to run at all, and you're only going to be able to manage it through vCenter. The problem is, if vCenter were to go offline, you can no longer manage that system. It's completely stopped. So you could choose to go to normal instead. And if you go to normal, it says you can't access the console directly from the machine, but you can do it through the local console. What the heck does that mean, the local console? Well, what this means is you could physically walk up to it and see the console. So what's the point of that? Well, you can actually access the DCUI from an SSH session. If you SSH into an ESXi box and you just type DCUI and press enter, it'll launch the console right there in your SSH session. And so you can access it remotely. This will stop that. That'll stop you from being able to run it in an SSH session. but you still have it on the physical console itself. And the idea is there that you have physical security that stops people from getting to the server. So that's why that's the normal mode. But strict is what I normally use, where I want to make sure if this server is out somewhere where I can't control it, I want it to be strict. You've got to have vCenter to get to it. There's no other way. So we can turn that on, and that would be a part of our security profile, and that can be pushed out as part of the host profile. You do also have exception users, which is kind of nice if you're worried about getting locked out part. As long as the DCUI service is running, you can specify users that are able to get into it, and so the exception users are right there. With strict mode, you can't really do an exception because they can't even get to the login screen, but in normal mode you can, and that's where you put the exception. If somebody SSHs in with a particular account, they'll still be able to launch that console. All right, what else do I have? Couple more little odds in it. I know we're running low on time, but let me see if we can get these in here. So a few more things on the ESXi hosts. Network security. I mentioned the firewall that's built into the network. There's actually a few other network settings that can be applied to the host that help for protection from things like denial of service attacks, right? And these are tucked away in the virtual switch that the hosts are plugged into. So if we want to see these, I'm in my host right now. So I'm in PLAB ESX01. And I'm on the Manage screen, and there's this Networking tab. If I jump over to Networking, you'll see Virtual Switches. That's the virtual switch that we're plugged into. You even get a little picture of it that kind of shows your virtual machine network plugged into this virtual switch, plugged into a physical adapter. Well, that virtual switch has certain security protections built into it to save us from denial of service type attacks. And if we edit that, it's going to come up, and you'll see this security tab over here, and you'll see 3 settings that we can tweak that have to deal with hardening the server. First is promiscuous mode. By default, a virtual network adapter will only receive traffic that's destined for that adapter. So if I have an IP address and a MAC address that identifies me, and traffic comes in that's destined for somebody else's IP and MAC address, I'll throw it away. But if you're running software like Wireshark, network sniffers, they want to go into promiscuous mode where they'll accept traffic from any IP and any MAC address because they want to record it. And that's blocked by default. So that's turned on. That's a default setting. If you have a machine you're using for network monitoring, you might need to turn this off so that you can do that monitoring. But you'd want to make sure that you created a dedicated virtual machine network for your system so you're not turning it on for everybody, right? It's tied to that switch. The virtual switch can be plugged into the same physical network, but it needs to be a separate separate virtual switch so you can tweak this setting. MAC address changes. By default, a virtual machine can change its MAC address and it'll allow that. You can change that to reject it. Now, if a virtual machine changes its MAC address, it assumes that you're trying to spoof an address and it stops it. So you can kind of block that access. But this last one is the most important one, forged transmits. If the virtual switch sees a MAC address coming in on a port that's different than the last port it saw it on, it assumes it's a forged transmit. And so you can tell it to reject that. The problem is, what if I actually move the virtual machine? What if I move the virtual machine from one vSwitch to another? Well, it's going to look like a forged transmit and it's going to get blocked. So it's off by default. Yeah, it is off, sorry. Forged transmits are accepted by default. I might want to turn that off to make it more restrictive. I just need to be aware that anytime I move a virtual machine to another vSwitch, it might trigger this and block the traffic, right? So we've got to be careful with how we move that. Same thing with MAC address changes. If we choose to reject changes, we need to be aware of that on our systems. These are all designed to kind of help protect us. On the denial of service attack side, somebody might try flooding your ESXi host so that nobody can get to the VMs. And so right over here, you'll see where we can do traffic shaping. Traffic shaping is where we can restrict the amount of bandwidth that's allowed to pass through the ESXi host to always leave a little room for you to be able to manage it. So you can start to set peak and burst size and so on to limit the amount of traffic passing through it. Those are a few other settings. The last thing that I want to point out is that if you've got vCenter, you manage your virtual machines and your ESX hosts all right from here. But every ESX host has a web interface, right? This machine is 192.168.0.3 and it's running a web service. It's actually running 2 web services. So it's running a couple of different things on it. And back in episode 2, when we created an ESXi host, I browsed that web page so that we could see it. Well, that web page is always there. And clients can try and connect to it, and they can download the vSphere client. Do you want just anybody on your network downloading the vSphere client? Well, there's other places they can get it, but this is making it easy, right? So we can actually turn off the web interface on our ESXi host. There's two different web interfaces. There's the main one, the one that we normally see. That's the one that provides the web interface for ESXi and the data store browser. It's what lets you see all sorts of information about the virtual machines that are stored on that ESX box. So that's the main interface. And if we're not using it, if we're using vCenter or we're using the shell, then we can turn that web interface off. The second interface is called the Managed Objects Browser, the MOB. And the Managed Objects Browser, what that one does is it provides all the statistical information about your ESXi box. So when you're managing it in vCenter, it's pulling through its own system. But when you log in through the vSphere client, the native client, all the statistics on like bandwidth and memory utilization and all that stuff is being fed through the MOB. Well, again, if you're not using it, if you're just using vCenter, you can turn off the MOB. And so you can do that. It has to be done from the command line, though. You normally do it from the console of that machine. If SSH is enabled, you can just SSH into it and get it set. So, for example, we have SSH on one of these boxes. It might be on my domain controller, but I think it's on this one. Oh, yeah, it's right there. So I can SSH into that box, and I can get it set, assuming SSH is actually running. And it looks like it is, because I got a certificate prompt. And let me just get logged into it. And it's taking its time. SSH might not be running. So I'm applying a security profile right now, so some various things could be happening. Well, it's asking for a password. That's a good sign. Oh, I think I put the wrong password in. Well, there's security for you, right? It's got to have the right password, or it's not going to let us in. But once I get to the shell, from there, I'll be able to disable those two web interfaces, and we'll get a chance to see it. All right, well, apparently I don't know my password. So let's jump over to my other machine where I do know the password. So this will be the ESX box that I fired up back in episode 2. I'm just going to fire up good old Putty, and I'm going to SSH into that turkey. And once I get logged in, I'm just going to log in as root and throw in my password. There we go. All right, so now I'm in the ESX terminal, right? And so I'm in the shell, and I'm able to issue commands. And there's a neat command in here called vim-cmd, and it lets you do all sorts of crazy stuff, right? So you got a bunch of different commands for modifying the way the system functions, and what I want to do is I want to disable the two web interfaces, the primary interface and the Managed Object Browser. I'm just going to turn those off. So the command to do that is vim-cmd and then proxy svc. The web page uses a proxy, and so it's the proxy that I'm actually working with. So I'm modifying the proxy service. And the command I want to send to it is remove_service. So I'm removing a service from the proxy. And the proxy location is / this is the root, the main web page. And then I need to tell it that I'm removing HTTPS with redirect. All right, now, what does that mean? Well, let me show you. If I fire up a web browser, and I left it open. Let me fire up a clean web browser. I'm going to browse that host. Now I'm going to browse to HTTP : //192 192.168.0.156 right there. I'm not doing it securely. I'm just doing HTTP. And when I browse to it, I hit a redirector. It's redirecting me to the secure page, HTTPS, and now I'm looking at that main page. Okay. So when I delete this, I'm deleting the site at root, and I'm deleting HTTPS with redirect. I don't want the HTTP version or the redirect to be there. That's what we're yanking out and pulling that from the system. So that one command right there is going to disable the web interface. And so I'll see successfully removed service. But there is still a second web interface, the Managed Object Browser. It's still there and running. So I need to get rid of it. And the command is basically the same, except the Managed Object Browser is in the /mob folder. That's actually an alias. And so we'll use that /mob and remove that service also. So now we've yanked those two services out, and they're no longer running. So what happens is the web interface is no longer functioning. So if I fire up a web browser, and I go to 192.168.0.156, and I try and pull up that page, I get 404 web page cannot be found. The web service is no longer running. And if I try and be sneaky and go to /mob, 404 not found. Okay, the web server's still there, and it even tried to forward me to secure, right? It always does that, but the pages are no longer present. I've removed those virtual directories. So if we're trying to harden our system, this is yet another way to do it. Now, personally, I don't usually do it this way, right? This way's on the exam. That's why I bring it up here, right? We want to make sure you do well on the exam. But in real life land, I usually just modify the software firewall and set the software firewall to say only allow connections on port 80 to these IPs and port 443, and I leave these services running, right? But you need to know for the exam that you can disable them, and you can disable them with a command just like this. It turns them off and gets them out of there. We saw the firewall earlier, so you guys have seen that route too. If for some reason you need to turn them back on, the command to turn it back on is actually a little bit longer. I'll put them in the show notes. But instead of saying vim-cmd proxy service remove service, we're going to say add TCP service. So we're adding a service back, and it's going to be that / with HTTPS redirect. But I need to add one little thing to the end, 8309. Which is a little internal number that it uses for that port. And it says that, oh shoot, I forgot the host name. My host name is just localhost, so it's not anything spectacular anyway. And we can throw that right back on there. And I know what you're thinking, Don, 8309, it's not port 8309, it's supposed to be port 80. Well, what they do is each of these little services that run inside of it, it puts them onto different port numbers, different kind of settings, and so it's going to attach it there, at least it's supposed to. So let's go back here and check and see what happens, and sure enough, I get the web page, right? I connect to the web server on port 80, but on the back end, the proxy is tied to port 8309, so that's why that number is wrong. So you can put them back in, and I'll put those commands in the show notes, like I said. Same thing for the MOB, right? You would run a similar command to turn that back on, so easy enough to flip it on and off. You'd have to do it this way if you wanted to turn one off and leave the other on. But if you were trying to turn them both off, just use the firewall. It's easier. That method is a little more effective.
Don, we appreciate you showing us how to harden the hosts themselves. Now, I know that we still got, vCenter to go, we got the VMs to go, but looking at the time, looks like we're going to save that for another part. But before we sign out, do you got any additional words, as it relates to the hosts?
Yeah. Remember, all the things that I just talked about are on the exam, so that's important. You need to know them. But that doesn't mean you have to use them in real life. Look at each of these and figure out which ones make sense for you. If you've only got 5 hosts, you probably don't need host profiles. You might just want to manually configure each one individually. If you have 500 hosts, you absolutely need host profiles, right? But you pick and choose which components work in your environment, the settings that are most friendly, and you're always trying to balance ease of use with security and find that healthy middle ground where you make things nice and secure but not a nightmare to use.
Well, Don, we appreciate you being in the studios with us, and we appreciate you, the viewers, signing out for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.